What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 23. I am Kyle Anslone, and I'm joined by the co host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
Kyle, how are you doing this evening?
Pretty good. Got a full list of stuff to talk about today and some really important stories in here. And so, just real quick before we get rolling on it, to remind everybody to subscribe to the new show somewhere if you're potentially still listening on any of the old foreign policy focus feeds. Everything should be switched over to conflicts of interest now. So go ahead and try to search up the conflicts of interest if you're still listening on the foreign policy focus feeds. And then if you haven't already, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're adding new subscribers there every day. And it's a video version of the show that adds, I think, an awful lot to it. It makes it a really cool experience. So be sure to check out the show on YouTube if you haven't yet. And with that, let's get into the show today, Will.
Let us do it.
First story today. Top 50 U.S. think tanks receive over $1 billion from government and defense contractors. This was a new study. I have it written up here by Barbara Boland at the American Conservative. She did a great job writing up this story. And some of the highlights that she has is this study that was ranked by the University of Pennsylvania found that $1 billion went either from the U.S. government directly or through the intermediary of one of the defense contractors, and then ends up going to the think tanks who write the different policy position papers and everything like that that politicians use to make our defense policy. And so somebody from Rand or the Center from New American Security, the New America Foundation, or we'll go over some others I'm sure on today's show, all are receiving millions and millions of dollars from either the government or these companies, and then they turn around, defense contractors, and then they turn around and they produce studies that say, oh, we need more war, we need more tanks, we need more F-35s, or whatever the hell it is. And so, Will, what did you think of this story?
Yeah, I thought this was a great. Barbara Boland did a great job writing this thing up, and I think it's based on like a combination of different data, like that use some of the data from the University of Pennsylvania, and then also I think the actual like organization that did the report was the Center for International Policy. So they brought together quite a few different data sets here. But yeah, as you're saying, they looked at the top 50 U.S. think tanks and found, surprise, surprise, that they're heavily funded by the U.S. government and the broader military-industrial complex, to the tune of something like $1 billion over 5 years. Between 2014 and 2019, I think is when this report looks at. I'm not totally sure why they picked those dates, but I got the idea that was just like some of the most recent and best data that they had, which I believe they're mostly deriving from like the think tank's own self-reported financial records. So that's good to keep in mind that that's a lot of what this is based on. But the organizations to get the most money, you named a few of them there, were like Rand Corp, the Center for New American Security, or CNAS, which is like the liberal hawk version of the neocons PNAC, or the Project for a New American Century, very reliably hawkish organization there, as well as the New America Foundation, which I think just goes by New America nowadays. And their current president is Anne Marie Slaughter, which, if people are familiar with like some of the interventionists in the Obama administration, she was one of them. I think she had a job in the State Department, and she was, for every single disastrous intervention during that administration, Libya and Syria being the two main ones. So like the top three think tanks, I think, do give you a good idea of who's getting all this money from arms dealers and the government itself. It is, sort of, as you said, precisely the organizations that are going to churn out reports and papers saying how absolutely necessary it is for the U.S. military to be, occupying the planet, and for us to be slapping sanctions on everybody. So it makes sense to me why they would be getting these piles of cash. They are the ones that reliably serve the U.S. foreign policy agenda, of the U.S. empire, or what we call the blob. And this $1 billion they're looking at, I think it was handed out in the form of 600 separate donations. So it's kind of spread out from around 70 different sources, whether those were private military contractors or actual government agencies. In terms of the arms dealers, the names that are pretty much the ones you would expect, the top donors are Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and also Airbus, who they build warplanes, I think. So we have all the usual suspects in terms of the arms dealers, and then with the government agencies, it's again, as you'd sort of expect, it's the Pentagon as a whole, it's various individual branches of the military, so like the Air Force and the Army, as well as like the DHS and the State Department. So those are like the primary government donors. The Rand Corp actually got the vast majority of this money that they're looking at between 2014 and 2019. I think they actually got over $1 billion themselves. So that was like the lion's share of this billion they're talking about. Whereas like CNAS and New America and there's another institution, the Atlantic Council, is also pretty high on the list. That's like NATO's think tank. They all got like around like $8 million. So that's like vastly lower than what Rand got. And I think it's because Rand, like unlike these other think tanks, the Rand Corp works on a lot of issues that go beyond policy alone, like doing like real scientific research and stuff on things like weapon systems and artificial intelligence and computing and a huge range of stuff. So I guess it kind of makes sense why they would have got the most money. But I guess just the last thing I'll say, like I think some of our listeners will recognize some of the other names of these think tanks that are high on the list. You had the Council on Foreign Relations. I think everyone's pretty familiar with them. The German Marshall Fund, the Brookings Institution, the Heritage Foundation, which is like a conservative thing, and then also the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is it's another one of these like highly prestigious Beltway think tank that's been around forever. It's another one of these things that reliably pushes the U.S. foreign policy agenda. And that last one, CSIS, they're heavily funded also by foreign backers, by like the UAE and Gulf monarchies and stuff. And I think the same organization, the Center for International Policy, they've also got a report out on like foreign backers of our U.S. think tanks. And so there's all kinds of like, dodgy stuff going on behind the scenes, I think, with the funding of these think tanks, which are very influential in sort of shaping policy and public opinion.
Yeah, one of the reasons I really want to talk about this story, Will, is because when you look at things that happen, especially in Washington D.C., and when something happens in like foreign policy news will come up, like the time 4 U.S. soldiers were killed in Niger. Even somebody who is a foreign policy hawk and I think is kind of known for having a little bit more foreign policy prowess, Lindsey Graham, was unaware that the U.S. had soldiers stationed in Niger. And so, if Lindsey Graham even doesn't know kind of where all U.S. soldiers are stationed in Africa, there's probably not a senator who does.
Right.
Potentially like Rand Paul or Mike Lee or Chris Murphy or somebody are people with a little bit more interest, but generally, if you've ever listened to committee hearings with like members of the House or senators and they talk about foreign policy, it's pretty clear that they are not very informed. They might be able to talk about healthcare policy and Obamacare pretty well. But when it comes to, explaining like what, legal authorization the U.S. is using to carry out increasing, military strikes in Somalia, many of them may be unaware that there's an increase in number of military strikes even going on in Somalia to begin with. And so, these reports are even more important because it's like I feel like kind of the mainstream media for the political class here.
Right.
It's like you see like a lot of Lockheed Martin or Raytheon commercials when you watch Fox News or any of these MSM channels, right? And so you have to imagine that they produce content that's like kind of friendly to these organizations and pro their war loving message. And that I think the same kind of thing happens here where you get the donations from the weapons makers and then these people produce reports and these reports are just critical to Washington D.C. again, and trying to explain here because the congressmen really don't have a whole lot of their own personal information on what's going on in the Middle East. And so when CNAS or whoever else writes up a report that says, oh, this dictator must be kicked over or else the Middle East will erupt in flames and it's going to be awful. Well, they have no other information to dispute that. And, this is a tank. And so that's that's the real catch that they kind of use. And it just seems like everybody kind of buys it and laps it up. And of course it is used a little bit for the general public too. They do, them produce these reports on Fox News or CNN and have whatever former intelligence or military official on there to say, oh yeah, they're absolutely right about this, and if we don't follow this exact policy prescription and buy 100 more tanks and 100 more planes and 3 aircraft carriers, well then I mean China's gonna be invading and oof, you don't want to be an American because you're gonna be speaking Mandarin by, 2023 or something if we don't get this done. And it works obviously because they're getting millions and millions of dollars. They're a part of this huge like money laundering scheme here where they take our tax dollars and give a little bit to everybody else on the way, and then they say, hey, look, we got some health care for you that's kind of crappy on the other end or something like that. So what, I don't know, Will, anything on that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, like they're massively influential. Like you're saying, like a lot of government officials do rely on them when they're crafting policy. They'll cite these reports and stuff. But it also just permeates, I think, through like the mainstream media. A lot of these like think tankers in the Beltway are they're the go-to sources for a lot of journalists there who like they need some mucky muck expert to comment on Syria or whatever. They go straight to CNAS or one of these type of reliably establishment
Rand
think
is a
tanks.
big one for that.
Right, right. Yeah, they just have these sort of experts for hire. And it really turns into this huge racket, like self-licking ice cream cone kind of thing, where again the government's feet they're pouring money into these think tanks basically to produce reports of what they already want to hear, of the things they already want to do, and then they turn around and cite those reports to justify what they already wanted to do. So it's just this big racket, this big circular thing that it's no surprise to me that we see $1 billion being handed out, and I suspect there's probably more. This is just based on like the records that the think tanks themselves report, and some of their records are weird too, where they'll report things as a range. So like this contribution was between $25,000 and $100,000, which gives them like a lot of wiggle room to like round up or down. And so we might actually be talking about 2 or 3 or $4 billion here when if you really drill down to this stuff.
Yeah, I forget what agency I was looking at, but I was trying to figure out how much the Qatari government gave to one of these think tanks, and the range was 2,500 to $5 million was the donor level they were at. I was like, wow, that is a big difference.
Very
Um,
useful figure there.
yeah, right. And it is strange how they get away with being able to do this and take money from foreign governments and have the State Department pour in money to these organizations. And as we've seen more recently, or I guess most recently, with like the FDD, Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, where they've
Yeah.
received money and then they'll go and attack American citizens with fake propaganda. And so I believe Matt Blumenthal has been a target of this campaign where, they take money and then, yeah, just slander American citizens, with our kind of funding from our own tax dollars. I mean, I'm sure they're not like, oh, this is the particular $10 from Matt Blumenthal and we're giving it to FDD to, for them to go on Twitter and insult him. But that
Right.
is kind of how it all ends up playing out. And so, I feel particularly insulted in this whole thing because me and you are working so hard to try to give people a different narrative, and yet for every dollar we make and we have to pay a certain percentage in taxes, the government's going to take a certain percentage of that and give it to the people who are pushing the false narrative that we're trying to debunk, and that is just extremely
Yeah.
frustrating.
That is depressing, man. I never really thought of it like that. That like, they're taking the money that we earn trying to do this stuff and handing it to like the worst possible actors in the media realm. So, yeah, that's something.